All right, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. All right, so I'm going to talk about blame, and in particular, the question I'm interested in is under which conditions is an agent blameworthy, and for what exactly is it is that agents are blameworthy for. And I'm just going to start by telling you the thesis. So the thesis that I'm going to defend is that agents are morally blameworthy only for intentional wrongdoing. And so that's the thesis that I'm going to defend, and I'm just going to set some stage. So here's why that's a thesis that's worth defending. So one thing is that probably a lot of people, I think probably most people in the debate on blame think that that's obviously false. So it's a very controversial thesis, and I'm going to say a lot more as to why we should accept it. Another reason why I think it's a thesis that's worth defending, or another, perhaps, as you might put it, another contribution of the paper, is that I'm going to follow a different methodology from the kind of methodology that generally is followed in the debates on blame and praise. So I think there are kind of two directions, roughly, that people come from when they think about which actions are blameworthy from. One kind of very common way of approaching it is that you think about lots and lots of cases, and you kind of consult your intuitions about whether or not the agent is blameworthy in those particular cases, and then you kind of try to, you do a little bit of a narrow reflective equilibrium, and you try to kind of engineer a theory that's going to yield the right verdicts about those cases. Kind of another direction from which a lot of people in the debate on blame are coming is they come from a general theory about responsibility and what it takes to be morally responsible for an action. And then they just kind of apply their theory to, so they have like they have kind of big and general conditions as to what it is to be a responsible agent, and then they kind of try to follow through the implications as to which actions agents are blameworthy for. So that's kind of two big strands in the literature. Obviously, simplifying quite a lot and zooming out quite a lot. I want to take a different tack. So I want to think about blame by thinking about by starting with the reactive attitude itself, and kind of thinking about how it relates with other reactive attitudes. And in a way, one way you can think about this talk is like I'm going to start thinking about reactive attitudes, and then we're just going to see where the argument leads us. It's going to lead us, I'm going to suggest it's going to lead us to the view that agents are blameworthy only if they engage in intentional wrongdoing. And then what I want to suggest is that that's not, that might seem like a really weird and radical place to end up with. But I think once we think through the details of this, I think it's going to be actually quite an attractive and plausible view. So that's just kind of so you know what the plan is. Okay, so so here's an argument for why I think agents are blameworthy only if they engage in intentional wrongdoing. And roughly the argument is as follows. So I put it on your handout. I think an agent is morally blameworthy for a particular action, if and only if it's appropriate for her to feel remorse for that action. And second premise, it's appropriate for an agent to feel remorse for an action if and only if, in performing that action, she intentionally acted wrongly. And so I think it follows that an agent is morally blameworthy for an action if and only if, in performing that action, she intentionally acted wrongly. So I should say I put it here as an if and only if claim, but I'm going to be, I think the sufficiency claim is not that controversial. I'm going to be mostly concerned with the necessity claim. Okay, so let me tell, so that's the big argument. Let me tell you a little bit more about the premises. So why should we think that an agent is morally blameworthy for an action if and only if it's appropriate for her to feel remorse for that action? I think that's because, if we think about kind of reactive attitudes, very often reactive attitudes come in pairs, or they're partner reactive attitudes. And I think remorse in particular is the partner attitude to blame. It's kind of when you blame someone, what you want, in part, perhaps part of the reason why you're blaming them in the first place is because you want them to feel remorse for their action. Like ideally, you want them to apologize, and what you think it takes we think it takes for there to be sincere apology is for the person to express remorse. So kind of quite naturally, if we think that there is this close relationship between blame and remorse, then it's very natural to think that, when whatever the appropriateness conditions for blame are going to be, they should also track the appropriateness conditions for remorse. So, like the thought that blame and remorse are really closely related, that's quite recently that has been defended by Miranda Fricker, I think in one of her papers. I'm not sure it's out yet. It's definitely forthcoming in news. So there, in that paper, she argues that in fact there's a kind of blame, second personal communicative blame, she calls it, that who's like it aims, like its proper aim is to elicit remorse in the other person. I'm not sure I would want to tie myself to the particular kind of communicative second personal blame that she ties herself to, but still the thought that kind of blame and remorse are really closely related, that strikes me as a very plausible thought. Okay, so much for premise 1. So let's see about premise 2. So according to so I've said that it's appropriate for an agent to feel remorse for an action if and only if, in performing the action, she has intentionally acted wrongly. Okay, why think that that's right? Well, I think one way to see that this is plausible is to think about our practice of apologies and of apologizing. So think about what it takes, under which conditions we think someone has genuinely expressed remorse for an action. Suppose that I've harmed you, and now I say, I'm so sorry, I did this, it wasn't intentional. Or I say, oh, I'm so sorry, I did this, I didn't realize that it was wrong. I think in both of these cases, insofar as you are blaming me, and I think there's something about this response on my part that makes my apology somewhat unsatisfactory. So it seems like, insofar as I have appealed to the fact that my wrongdoing was unintentional, or either because I say, I didn't do it intentionally, or because I say I didn't realize that it was wrong, in both of these cases, I haven't really properly owned up to my wrong action. It seems like seems like expressing remorse is a way of kind of taking responsibility for what you have done. And insofar as I appeal to my action being unintentional or my not realizing that it's wrong, it seems like I haven't properly taken responsibility for that action. It seems like I haven't properly kind of owned up to it. And you might find, insofar as you were blaming me, you might find my response seriously falling short. Like you would, insofar as what you were hoping for, I think, is that I fully say, yes, I'm really sorry, I shouldn't have done this. And that's the end of it. So what that suggests is that, at least when expressing remorse, what we want someone to own up to the fact that they have acted wrongly and that they have done it intentionally. And I think that suggests that more generally, what it is to kind of take the reactive attitude of remorse to your action is a matter of owning up to the action, of kind of acknowledging that it has violated some moral standard and that in doing so you have acted intentionally. Okay, so if we put this together, where we end up with, so if we accept this and we also accept that blame and remorse are kind of these partner attitudes in this particular way, what we end up with is the conclusion that an agent is morally blameworthy for an action if and only if they intentionally acted wrongly. So in one way, just kind of stepping back for a moment, I think this conclusion shouldn't really strike us all that surprising. I mean, just think about the way in which we often express blame when we're blaming someone. I mean, one thing that's, really when we're really indignant about someone's acting, you might say something like, I can't believe what she did. She did this on purpose, right? That's kind of saying to someone, you did it on purpose, or like you knew exactly what you were doing. That's a really common and a very natural way, at least, to express blame and to blame someone. And on the other hand, think about how we defend ourselves or defend others when we are being blamed. Kind of a really natural way to make an excuse is to say, oh, look, I'm so sorry, this wasn't intentional. Or, I had no idea that this was wrong. So whatever it is, these appeals to unintentional, to this action being unintentional seem to be doing kind of major work in our practice of blaming and apologizing and expressing remorse. Or we might say about someone else, don't blame them. They weren't doing this intentional, or they didn't realize what they were doing. There again, it seems like we're excusing, or at least we're appealing to mitigating factors, and that mitigating factor is the fact that they did something intentionally or unintentionally. So it seems like, as far as our actual practice of blaming agents is, whether or not, and kind of how we evaluate an action, whether or not their wrongdoing was intentional or not, is really important. I think in general, actually, there's some social psychology research which suggests that, in fact, that agents, whether or not how badly they experience pain when another person is giving them electric shocks, that depends as well on whether they think that the other person is harming them intentionally or not. So kind of in general, it seems like whether or not an action is intentional plays this major role in how we morally assess it. And so maybe the conclusion shouldn't be all that surprising. And it's kind of, what might be more surprising is that somehow this distinction between intentional and unintentional wrongdoing doesn't play a bigger role in most kind of contemporary theories of blame or moral responsibility. Okay, so I've given you an argument and I've arrived at the conclusion that you're blameworthy only if you intentionally acted wrongly. But of course, so far, I haven't really, so in order to see what exactly that commits us to, as far as individual cases are concerned, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to sharpen sharpen the notion of intentional wrongdoing, right? I've just left it so far. I've left it kind of, I've left it intuitive as an intuitive notion. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to suggest that we understand intentional wrongdoing in a particular way. And the conditions that I'm going to suggest are going to be really strong conditions. So to put it in other words, it turns out that it's going to be not so easy to commit an instance of intentional wrongdoing. I'm not going to defend the account of intentional wrongdoing majorly. I think it's something that we can talk about in the Q&A, but I think that if we can make the conclusion plausible with this strong notion of intentional wrongdoing, then I think, that is just all the better for the conclusion. So that's why I'm kind of going to go with a particularly strong account of what it takes to engage in intentional wrongdoing. Okay, so what is it to engage in intentional wrongdoing? Okay, well, so wrongdoing in general, I'm going to take to be a matter of violating a moral norm. So of course, how do we violate moral norms? Well, we violate a moral norm by performing some action that's prohibited by that moral norm. Okay, so the question now is, what does it take to violate that moral norm intentionally? Well, just think about a non-moral case of a norm violation. So just consider Jones, who's kind of driving along at 75 miles per hour, while the speed limit is 65 miles per hour. So what needs to be true of Jones in order for it to be true that he violates the speed limit intentionally? Well, one thing that needs to be true is that he intentionally drives at 75 miles per hour, right? So if he just lost control of the car and he just watches kind of powerlessly as the speed goes higher and higher, then I take it, he might be violating the speed limit, but he's not doing it intentionally. So it seems like one condition is that he needs to intentionally drive at the speed that's higher as the speed limit. But a second condition is some kind of epistemic condition, right? He needs to be aware of what the speed limit is. If Jones is driving at 75 miles per hour, but he wrongly believes the speed limit to be 75 miles per hour, or perhaps 80 miles per hour, then I take it he's not violating the speed limit intentionally, right? He needs to be somehow, in some sense, he needs to have epistemic access to the fact that the speed limit is lower than the speed that he's driving at. Okay, and here's where I'm going to make the really strong assumption. So I'm going to assume that what it takes for Jones, I'm going to assume that the way we should spell out that epistemic accessibility relation is in terms of knowledge. So I'm going to assume that in order to intentionally violate the speed limit, he needs to intentionally drive at 75 miles per hour, and he needs to know that he is driving faster than the speed limit. Okay, so I think there are good reasons here. So this is something that we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. I think there are good reasons for going in for knowledge here, as opposed to some weaker condition like belief or true belief or justified true belief. One thing that it does, that going for knowledge does it makes it, as you see, it makes it pretty hard to engage in intentional wrongdoing in the moral case, because you require that the person knows that what they're doing is wrong. But I think that even with this strong condition, the conclusion that an agent is morally blameworthy for an action only if she intentionally acts wrongly in performing it is one that turns out to be pretty attractive and plausible. So I'm just going to go with that account of intentional wrongdoing. Okay, so let's just put the two things together. So let's put together the conclusion from my argument from remorse together with this account of intentional wrongdoing. Okay, what follows is that an agent is morally blameworthy for an action if and only if she intentionally performed that action and she knew that that action is wrong. Okay, so let me just note one kind of case that people worried about. Let me just note one case that this seems to get right. So suppose that I'm unaware that the sugar bowl contains poison, and I pass it to you, and then you die as a result. It seems like intuitively, it seems like I'm not blameworthy for killing you or for poisoning you, and at least the conclusion that we've arrived at kind of yields exactly that verdict. I might have poisoned you, but I did it unintentionally. I know that poisoning you is wrong, but I didn't realize that what I was doing was poisoning you, right? Because I didn't know that I didn't intentionally poison you. I didn't know that the sugar bowl contained poison. Okay, still, you might be worried about. So that seems, whatever other problems the conclusion has, at least that kind of case, it does seem to get right. But still, you might be really worried that we end up with a view of blame in which just way too many, there are too many actions for which agents are let kind of off the moral hook. So what I want to do now is I just want to draw out that it's not as bad as you might have thought. So just kind of to be clear on what doesn't follow from the view. Okay, so I said in order to be blameworthy, for an action, you need to have performed that action intentionally, and you need to know that that action is morally wrong. Okay, so one thing that's really important to be clear on is that it doesn't follow from this that you are never entitled to blame an agent who engaged in some unintentional wrongdoing. But this is because many, or perhaps even most, cases of instances of unintentional wrongdoing also involve intentional wrongdoing. Right? So here are some cases from the literature that people have been worried about and that they've taken to show that that blameworthiness does not require intentional wrongdoing. So first case, deadly smoothie, that's a version. Peter Graham discusses a similar case. So, suppose that Tony plans to kill his ex-lover Max, and he intends to do this by smuggling peanuts into Max's green smoothie that Max enjoys on a daily basis. And Tony believes that Max has a really severe peanut allergy. So, if he puts peanuts into this green smoothie, Max is going to have an allergic reaction and die. But Tony is mistaken. Max has just taken a really unreliable allergy test. He's not, and also he's a bit of a hypochondriac. He's not allergic to peanuts at all. And he just really enjoys the smoothie with the peanuts in it with no ill effect. So you might think, well, Tony didn't kill Max. There was nothing he didn't do anything wrong, kind of objectively wrong in giving Max the smoothie. But nevertheless, he seems morally blameworthy. Or take another case, blind driver. Suppose that Mary is really short-sighted, and as she's getting into the car, she realizes that she's forgotten her glasses, but because she's in a rush, she just decides to drive on anyway. And since she doesn't have her glasses, she doesn't see a child crossing a road and injures it very severely. So you might think Mary didn't injure the child intentionally, nevertheless, she seems morally blameworthy. Okay, so I agree that in both cases, the agents definitely are morally blameworthy. But I think the question is, what exactly is it that they're blameworthy for? And I think that in both cases, agents engaged in intentional wrongdoing, and that's in fact what they're blameworthy for. So, we can accommodate the intuition that both cases involve blameworthy actions, but that's precisely because both cases involve actions that are cases of intentional wrongdoing. So in the case of Tony and Max, Tony did not kill Max, but he attempted to kill Max. And you might think, I think it's in general true that if an action is morally wrong, then attempting the action is also morally wrong. So in other cases, in other ways, like attempted wrongdoing is itself an instance of intentional wrongdoing, right? So insofar as in giving Max the peanut smoothie, Tony attempted to kill Max, he of course is morally blameworthy. He is morally blameworthy for an attempt to kill Max. Similarly, plausibly, it's morally wrong. And in that sense, in that case, I understand this to mean like there's an objective moral norm prohibiting taking certain kinds of moral risks. And I take it in the case of Mary and the child, Mary intentionally took a moral risk. She knew that she was taking this risk, and she knew that taking this risk was morally wrong. Insofar as Mary is a competent, I'm assuming here that Mary is a competent moral agent. And insofar as that's what was happening, she did engage in intentional wrongdoing, and that's something that she is morally blameworthy for. So this is just to show that, it's not if you're going to be worried about counterexamples to this conclusion, they might not be as straightforward as you might have thought initially. I think probably most cases of negligence or other unintentional wrongdoing involve some kind of attempt or a knowing, or they involve knowingly taking a moral risk. Okay, so that's just kind of to forestall one worry about the main thesis and the conclusion. Here's another worry. Well, here's another thing to keep in mind. It doesn't, from the argument that I've presented, it doesn't follow that we shouldn't blame an agent anytime she claims moral ignorance. Right? So it's true that an agent is only blameworthy if she knew that her action is morally wrong. But it doesn't follow that just saying, well, I didn't know it was wrong, is going to that for that reason you're going to have to let the agent off the hook and you're not going to be entitled to blame them. What matters to whether or not they're blameworthy is whether or not they knew. So whether or not they were in a particular mental state. But of course, agents themselves may not always be in the best position to know what they know. And of course, they can be self-deceived about what they know. So, you know, Mary might have, so Mary, for example, might have, you know, there are good reasons why she should, why she might want to kind of forget or, you know, kind of cast aside the fact that she knew that she shouldn't take that risk. In fact, I think when you're going to be deciding whether or not someone is blameworthy for an action, if you're going to try to decide whether or not you should blame someone or whether you're entitled to blame someone for an action, I think the best decision procedure that you might adopt is to think about whether a reasonable person would know that that action was wrong. So, and the reason why the reasonable person test is going to be a good guide is not because that's what determines whether or not you're blameworthy, but because that is the best evidence for what the person in question might have known or might not have known. You know, so a lot of people kind of are very sympathetic to the view that, you know, what matters is whether you should have known that it's morally wrong. So in effect, I say, yes, like thinking about whether or not you should have known this is a really good way of determining whether or not you're entitled to blame someone. But that's because that's really good evidence for what the person in fact knew. It's certainly evidence that's a lot better than just their testimony about what they knew or not at the moment of action. Okay, so let me forestall a third worry. It doesn't follow that in order to be blameworthy for an action, the agent must know the precise nature of their wrongdoing. So, you know, what needs to be the case is that the agent knew that the action that they were performing was morally wrong. It doesn't matter whether they knew just kind of the exact way in which it was wrong. So here's an example, for example. Frat party. Suppose that a college football player engages in various non-consensual sexual activities, I leave that up to your imagination, with an intoxicated young woman at a fraternity party. And let's assume she's too intoxicated to consent. Then later on, he insists that he didn't know that what he was doing was rape. And let's just assume that he is really sincere in that. He really didn't know that what he was doing was rape. Is that enough for him to be blameless? Well, presumably not, because it doesn't matter whether he knew that what he was doing was rape. What matters is whether he knew that what he was doing was wrong. And I think in the kind of, at least in the kinds of cases that we're typically, you know, the kinds of cases in which these things typically arise, it's just very hard. It's just very hard to believe that they really genuinely it could not have occurred to them that, you know, the particular actions that they were performing were not morally wrong, even if, you know, they didn't think that they amounted to rape. So that's the kind of case where, it's enough that you know that what you were doing was wrong. It doesn't matter whether you knew just how precisely to categorize that wrongdoing. Okay, so that's just kind of three ways in which, so you might have thought that the conclusion we end up with, that agents are only morally blameworthy for intentional wrongdoing, it's just obviously crazy because it obviously kind of falls short of cases like Fred Party, or cases like Blind Driver, or cases like Deadly Smoothie. So what I was just trying to draw out was that it really doesn't. It's not as simple. Like the view that you end up with isn't quite as demanding on blameworthiness as you might have thought. Sorry, can I just check? What time did we start?
About 5:15.
Okay.
I'm sorry, 4:15.
4:15. Okay, great. So, all right. Okay, perfect. Okay, so, so far so good. But I take it you might still be worried. So you might still worry that, there are cases of pure. You might think there are still cases of pure unintentional wrongdoing. So, cases where the agent didn't kind of engage in some negligence. And you might think, so a lot of people think that cases of implicit bias might be like that, where, you're discriminating against a minority, but you're like, there's nothing intentional that you do. You just do it unintentionally. So that might be, and you might think, well, maybe aren't agents like on the moral hook for that kind of behavior? You might also worry that in cases like Mary, we've said, well, she did engage in some intentional wrongdoing, like she took a moral risk knowingly. But still, what about the fact that she injured a child? She did this unintentionally. Do we want to say that there's kind of nothing, that there's no reactive attitude we might take to her for injuring the child? We just have to always kind of target the prior action. So you might still worry that the view that we have ended up with just lets people off the moral hook too easily. So they're not going to be blameworthy, and therefore they're not going to be morally responsible for those actions. And you might think that's a really bad result. Okay, so I think that is a conclusion that follows only if you think that being blameless kind of implies being off the moral hook. Or if you think, if you're not blameworthy for an action, then you're not morally responsible for the action. Or if you think, if it's not appropriate for me to take the reactive stance of blame towards you, then there's no reactive attitude that I am entitled in taking to you. The only thing that I'm entitled towards your action is the kind of objective stance, where I just see this as like a causal upshot of your thing, but I don't hold you kind of person level to the action. But it's not clear to me why that is an assumption that we should accept. And in fact, what I want to do now in the remaining time is I want to suggest that that's an assumption that we should reject. So I think what I want to suggest is that while blame is a response that's restricted to intentional wrongdoing, so that an agent is blameworthy only if they engage in intentional wrongdoing, there is a distinctive reactive attitude that responds to unintentional wrongdoing. And I'm going to refer to that attitude as reproach. This is mostly for historical reasons, because I was inspired to think about this by a paper by Cheshire Colquhoun that's called Responsibility and Reproach. But if you have a better suggestion for a name, I'm open to suggestions. Okay, so obviously, you might think at this point, well, that's a bit of a cop-out, right? So that seems like a little bit of an ad hoc move just to save the cases. So I don't think it's an ad hoc move, because as I'm going to try to convince you now, I think there are independent motivations for thinking that there is a reactive attitude like this. And I'm going to point to two such independent motivations. So the first motivation is just think about our actual moral practice. So I think one kind of important part of our moral practice is that we do this thing that's called calling out people when they act wrongly. But very often, perhaps in most cases, calling out is different from blaming them. In fact, very many instances of calling someone out involve explicitly denying that you're blaming them. I think perhaps the nicest example of this is the gendered conference campaign on the feminist philosophers. So I think probably you all heard of that, right? But it's worth looking again at the actual email that feminist philosophers sent to those conference organizers who ended up with all male lineups. That email said, you know, I'm drawing to attention to this. This is bad for all of those reasons. You know, we're not blaming you for this. We realize that this could have come about in all kinds of different ways. And I think similarly, when you deal with children, that's very often also what you do. You know, imagine that like your 10-year-old makes a sexist or a racist remark at the dinner table. I think that's a situation in which you would call them out on the behavior, but you wouldn't blame them for it. In fact, you might say explicitly, look, you know, I don't know where you got this from. You know, you probably don't realize what it means. I'm not blaming you for this, but, you know, don't say this again. So it seems like there is this part of our moral practice that doesn't involve blaming, but yet that involves kind of drawing explicit attention. It involves drawing attention to wrongdoing. And in general, in fact, when we do this, we explicitly say, you know, I realize you're not doing this intentionally. I realize you're not realizing that this is what you're doing, or you're not realizing that what you're doing is wrong. So that seems to be part of our moral practice. Second, I think in those cases, it's not like you're assuming the objective stance towards the agent, right? You're like explicitly addressing them as moral agents. You're drawing their attention to something they have done, and you set the expectation that they will do better in the future. So what you say is, look, there's the standard that you have fallen short of unintentionally. I expect you to kind of pay attention that you don't do this in the future. So it seems like at least, and third of all, I think very often, you know, it's reasonable to even feel resentment when you're calling out someone in that way. So I think that's one thing that I'm setting aside explicitly. So I'm not thinking of, and I think it should be clear from how I set this up, right? I'm not thinking that blame just is resentment, right? I think that it's a little bit unfortunate that sometimes these two things are equated. I think it can be in those cases of calling out, I think if you're the party who has been harmed, it can be perfectly rational of you to feel resentment towards the other person while explicitly acknowledging that you're not blaming them. And I don't think there's anything incoherent or contradictory about this. Okay, so there's our moral practice. That's one reason for thinking that there is something distinctive there. There's a distinctive reactive attitude that might be associated with it that's different from blame, but that nevertheless is involved in kind of holding someone accountable for their actions. So there's a second independent reason, I think, why we should think that there is such a reactive attitude. And that is if we, again, look for partner reactive attitudes. So I said when I kind of arrived at the initial conclusion, I arrived there by way of thinking about the relationship between blame and remorse and how closely those are connected. So I think similarly, just as blame and remorse are partner attitude, there's also a partner attitude that's closely associated with the kind of with reproach, as I have called it, and with the kind of practice that I've pointed to just a moment ago. And I think that's the attitude of agent regret. I mean, that's Bernard Williams' term for it, right? Like, just consider Bernard Williams' quote. I've put it on your handout. It says, "Agent regret requires not merely a first personal subject matter, nor yet merely a particular kind of psychological content, but also a particular kind of expression. The sentiment of agent regret is by no means restricted to, well, he thinks it's not restricted to voluntary agency. It extends far beyond what one intentionally did to almost anything for which one was causally responsible or in virtue of something one intentionally did. So I think Williams is quite right that there's this attitude of agent regret that we take. That's not just an emotion. It's kind of involves seeing your action in a particular moral light, and that's quite natural and pervasive. And I think insofar as they're really, so just think about, again, kind of returning to the example of blind driver to Mary. I mean, the fact that even if kind of Mary might have not been blameworthy for the actual injury of the child, just for the prior negligence, it wouldn't be okay for Mary to just like get on with it and not feel bad about the injury of the child. And in fact, even if you have a driver who didn't do anything intentionally wrong and just kind of happened to be really unlucky, even in that case, I think we would think that there's something wrong with the person if they didn't feel bad, if they didn't feel terrible about the fact that they caused the injury or that they kind of killed a pedestrian or something like this. So it seems like there is this attitude, and it seems like it's appropriate to have it in the case of where you acted wrongly unintentionally. Okay, so those are two reasons why I think we should think that there's a distinctive reactive attitude that is associated with unintentional wrongdoing. So these were both kind of by looking at our actual moral practice. I think that there's a kind of third theoretical, or perhaps more theoretical reason why it makes sense for us to discriminate between intentional and unintentional wrongdoing, and why it makes sense to think that there are those two different reactive attitudes. And that's that while both in cases of intentional and unintentional wrongdoing, the agent violated a moral norm, right? So they fell short of a particular moral standard. The motivational failing on the part of the agent was quite different in those two cases. So in the case of intentional wrongdoing, the agent knew that what they were doing was wrong. So the fault here lies with the kind of desire or intention component of the agent. Like the agent didn't care enough about doing what's right. And in the case of unintentional wrongdoing, it seems like, if anything, the agent exhibited an epistemic failing. Like they didn't know what they were. They didn't know that what they were. Basically, they didn't know that what they were doing was morally wrong, right? And insofar as so, these are quite different failings. They're both moral failings, but they're failings of a quite different sort. And you might think, insofar as blame is a form of moral criticism, moral criticism should be targeted. So it makes sense that it's targeted in this particular way. And it makes sense that there's this other attitude that kind of targets a failing that's quite different in kind. Okay, so in the remaining time, let me just summarize where we're at. So I've suggested, by way of thinking of partner reactive attitudes, that blame is appropriate only in cases of intentional wrongdoing. And then I've suggested that we have good reasons for thinking that there's a separate reactive attitude that responds to unintentional wrongdoing. So as far as kind of responding to wrongdoing is concerned, we have these two different reactive attitudes that are appropriate depending on what kind of the nature of the wrongdoing was. So what I want to do just in the remaining time, in the remaining 5 minutes, is to step kind of back for a moment and look at the big picture. So just to think about, suppose we do accept the picture and we think, yeah, it does really matter whether the wrongdoing was intentional or unintentional. We accept the view of intentional wrongdoing that I have sketched. And so now, what kind of implications does this have? What can we do with this view? So I think one thing that's nice about it is that there are a few puzzles that I think, or a few well, actually not puzzles, like deep philosophical problems that it might give us a better grip on. So here's one problem, the problem of moral luck, right? So we've already said, well, you know, take Mary, who, take two negligent drivers, one who doesn't injure a child and one who does injure the child. Isn't it appropriate to feel differently towards the driver who injures the child than towards the driver who doesn't? And what I want to say is, yes, that's exactly right. And that's exactly what we should say if we think that there are those two different kinds of reactive attitudes. Because there's no reason why those, like reproach and blame, should be mutually exclusive. You know, at any particular moment, we're performing many actions. We perform some actions intentionally. We perform other actions unintentionally. There's no reason why the negligent driver who injures the child shouldn't be subject to both kind of blame for their negligence and to reproach for their injury. So in a way, you know, if it's true that we have these two different attitudes, then I think we can do better justice, perhaps, to the complexity of our responses to wrongdoing, and we can also explain why, kind of, in those moral luck cases, we think that different responses are warranted depending on how things turned out. Okay, so let me just mention a second thing that I think this gets right, or where it gives us a nice picture. I think the view that I have sketched gives us a really nice account of excuses and mitigating factors. So in particular, one thing that it suggests is that not all excuses are alike. You know, there are excuses which might show that genuinely no wrongdoing has occurred, right? So if you've been, you know, if I put your fingers on the trigger and press them for you, you know, you haven't really done anything wrong. So there might be some excuses in which when I appeal to certain factors, I might just be appealing to the fact that I haven't done anything wrong whatsoever. You might think that certain severe cases of coercion are like this, where, you know, if I say, you know, I'm going to kill you unless you rob the bank, and you say, you know, I was under threat, the person threatened to kill me if I don't rob the bank. It seems like that's, you know, it's what this does is this kind of excuse aims to establish that what you did wasn't really wrong. You know, that was the right thing to do. The right thing to do in that case was to save yourself or save someone else and rob the bank. But there's another kind of excuses where what you're doing is you're not exculpating yourself from wrongdoing. What you're doing is you're just modifying, or you're hoping to modify the kind of reactive attitude that it's appropriate to take towards you. So in cases where, you know, I say, oh, I didn't do this intentionally, and I think that's something that's really true to our actual experience. You know, in the cases where I say I didn't do this intentionally, it's not like I don't recognize. I'm not going to say, you know, you shouldn't resent me at all, or I don't think you're at all being rational and being upset about what I have done. I think you're just saying, you don't hold me to blame. You know, I didn't do it intentionally. So, so kind of excuses come in two flavors. There's some excuses which genuinely exculpate, which aim to establish that no wrongdoing occurred, and then there are some where they merely seek to mitigate the kind of reactive attitude that it's appropriate to take towards you. And in particular, I think that the excuses that where you appeal to moral ignorance, those are the excuses of the second kind. All right, and now I'm just going to end by kind of zooming out even further, and that's, I mean, all of these things I've just sketched really quickly, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A. And that's an implication for kind of a general for reactive accounts of moral responsibility. So there's this whole line kind of following Peter Strawson's famous paper, Freedom and Resentment, that we should think of kind of reactive attitudes as the key to our ascriptions of moral responsibility. So we shouldn't think that, you know, when we experience these reactive attitudes, that they track some independent facts about whether or not the agent is morally responsible, but rather kind of assuming those reactive attitudes just is a way of holding people responsible. And kind of one problem that all of these views face is to explain why, nevertheless, it seems like there are certain independent facts such that if those facts obtain, it doesn't seem appropriate to have any reactive attitudes towards the agent, right? It doesn't seem to be appropriate to have any particular reactive attitude towards someone who's severely schizophrenic and suffering an episode and they don't realize what they're doing. Gary Watson has this famous paper about the sociopath Peter Harris, I think, is this right? Robert Harris, and as part of this, he suggests that maybe it's not because of how facts about his upbringing, it might not be appropriate to experience these reactive attitudes towards him. So it seems like those views, there's this tension that they face. Okay, and I think one thing that perhaps if we think about blame and reproach as responses to intentional and unintentional wrongdoing respectively, one thing that this might give us is the resource to address this worry for reactive attitudes. Because you might think, while those reactive attitudes may not track independent facts about responsibility, they do track independent facts about whether or not the agent engaged in intentional or unintentional wrongdoing. And insofar as intentional or unintentional wrongdoing requires, among other things, moral knowledge. In order to be the kind of agent who's capable of engaging in intentional wrongdoing, you need to be the kind of agent who can discriminate right from wrong, someone who has the capacity for moral knowledge. And now there are certain facts about an agent's history which might suggest, or which might make it the case, that the agent is not capable of discriminating right from wrong. So in that case, we can give a principled explanation for why reactive attitudes are inappropriate in that case, but without kind of appealing to independent facts about responsibility. We very much still keep the feature that having reactive attitudes are ways of holding someone responsible. But the particular way in which you hold someone responsible, that is something that depends on the nature of their wrongdoing. All right, I'm going to end there.